He walked through the glass doors in worn denim and mud-caked boots, leaving small brown prints on the polished marble floor. The young host's nose wrinkled. Within seconds, he was turned away. Not with a word, but with a gesture, a dismissal so casual it cut deeper than any insult. What no one knew was that the man in those dirty boots had poured his life's blood into building this very empire 4 decades ago. His name was carved into the foundation. Now, as he stood outside looking in, the irony was almost unbearable. Inside, waiters moved through dining rooms he had designed, past walls painted in colors he had chosen, serving food prepared in kitchens he had revolutionized. And nobody recognized him. The question wasn't whether he would walk away. It was what he would do next. Thomas Whitmore had always believed that hard work spoke louder than designer suits. That morning in late September, as he climbed out of his truck at the flagship restaurant on Fifth Avenue, the very first location that had started it all, he wore the evidence of that philosophy on his boots and weathered hands. He had spent the pre-dawn hours at his ranch upstate, working alongside his groundskeeper to repair the fence line after last night's storm. Mud from the property still clung to the leather, and his jeans bore the stains of honest labor. His flannel shirt was wrinkled, rolled up at the sleeves, and his silver hair stuck out at odd angles from beneath an old Carhartt cap. The restaurant glowed before him, all marble and chrome and soft golden lighting. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see it exactly as it had been in his mind's eye in 1983, when he was 32 years old and believed that everything was possible. The tables were dressed in crisp white linens, the chairs upholstered in burgundy leather. His choice, back when his wife Clara was alive, and they would sit in this empty space dreaming together. The bar gleamed with bottles arranged just so, the kitchen visible through an enormous open window, where chefs moved in synchronized precision. He had designed every detail, fought with contractors over every measurement, tasted every dish on the opening menu more than 100 times. Thomas pulled the door open at 11:15 a.m., 15 minutes before lunch service officially began. A young man in a tailored black suit looked up from the host stand, his smile already prepared and practiced. Then the smile faltered. Thomas saw it happen, the exact moment the young man's eyes scanned downward and registered the boots, the jeans, the overall appearance of someone who belonged nowhere near this establishment. "I'm sorry," the host said, his voice carrying the rehearsed politeness of someone delivering bad news gently. "We're not open for lunch service yet. And, he paused, clearly searching for the right words. "We do ask that our guests maintain a certain dress code, even for early reservations." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. Not anger, not exactly. It was something more complicated, a hollow recognition that the world had moved on completely without him. He stood in the doorway in his work clothes, looking at a kid no older than 25 who didn't have the slightest idea who he was. "I'd like to speak with the manager," Thomas said quietly. "Of course," the host replied with the same tight smile, "but I have to let you know, our manager will probably say the same thing. We have standards here. Maybe if you came back after you've, freshened up." The words hung in the air between them, freshened up, as if Thomas Whitmore was some vagrant wandering in off the street, looking for a place to sit down. Thomas turned and walked back outside without another word. The glass door closed behind him with a soft hydraulic hiss, and he stood on the sidewalk watching the city move around him. Yellow cabs honked. Pedestrians in expensive coats strode past purposefully. The restaurant continued its morning preparations, indifferent to his presence or absence. He should have been angry. He had every right to march back in and demand to speak with the general manager, to explain exactly who he was and watch the color drain from that young man's face. He had done it before, in the early years, when someone would make a mistake about the brand or the vision. Thomas Whitmore was not a man accustomed to being dismissed, but something deeper had taken root inside him over the past few years. A quiet exhaustion that came from watching something you had created with your own hands become something else entirely. Somewhere along the way, the restaurant had stopped being his. It had become a machine, automated and efficient, designed to extract money from customers and minimize costs. The food was still good, excellent even, but it was no longer the expression of his philosophy. It was a product, and products didn't care who designed them. Thomas walked 2 blocks to a coffee shop, the kind that had probably existed for 40 years in one form or another, still run by people who actually cared about their customers. He ordered black coffee and a croissant and sat by the window watching the morning unfold. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. After 43 years of answering calls immediately, the idea of not answering one felt like a small rebellion. His ex-wife Maria would have laughed at him. She had left him in 1998, after 15 years of marriage, to a man who was always thinking about the restaurant, always at the restaurant, always talking about the restaurant. She had taken half of everything and moved to Santa Fe with her yoga instructor boyfriend. They still exchanged Christmas cards. His daughter Rebecca, born to him and Maria in 1990, had become a lawyer and actively avoided discussing the family business. His son Daniel, from his first marriage to Clara, had worked in the restaurant for a while, before realizing he had no passion for hospitality and became an accountant instead. Neither of them needed the restaurant. Neither of them had wanted it, really. The restaurant was Thomas's child, in a way that no human child could be. And like all children, it had grown up and stopped listening to its father. By noon, Thomas's phone had buzzed 7 times. He finally pulled it out and scrolled through the messages, mostly from his assistant, Carol, reminding him of meetings and deliveries and decisions that needed to be made. One text from his financial advisor about quarterly earnings. Nothing urgent. Nothing that actually required him to be present in the world. He had stepped back from day-to-day operations 5 years ago, handing most of the executive duties to a professional management team. It had seemed like the right decision at the time. He was 68 years old. He had health issues, a bad back, high blood pressure, the early signs of arthritis in his knees. Why not let younger people run the restaurants and enjoy the benefits of his life's work? He had enough money, more than enough. He could travel, spend time at his ranch, finally take that year-long sabbatical Clara had always wanted to take before she died of cancer in 2001. But the sabbatical never happened, and he hadn't traveled much. Instead, he had fallen into a quiet routine of ranch work and reading and long silences. He had lost the thread of something essential, though he couldn't have named it. Thomas returned to the restaurant at 2:15 p.m., when lunch service was in full swing. This time he was wearing a different outfit, clothes from his truck kept there for emergencies. Dark trousers, a button-down shirt, Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. He had showered in the gym he still belonged to, ran a comb through his hair, and put on a pair of expensive wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like exactly what he was, a wealthy man with time on his hands. The same host greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome to Whitmore's. How many for lunch today?" The name of the restaurant. Whitmore's. His name, right there on the reservations book, on the website, on the menus, on the leather jackets they gave to regular customers. Yet nobody here knew him. "I'd like a table for one," Thomas said, "and I'd like to speak with the general manager after I finish eating." "Of course, sir. We have a lovely table by the window. Our chef has prepared an extraordinary special today. Pan-seared scallops with a beurre blanc and microgreens. I think you'd find it exceptional." Thomas was seated immediately at the best table in the restaurant, the same table where he used to sit with Clara on quiet afternoons before opening day, dreaming about the future. A server appeared with a leather-bound menu and water with lemon. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as he had designed it to be. The scallops were indeed extraordinary, but not in the way the host had suggested. They were technically perfect, cooked precisely to temperature, plated beautifully, accompanied by a sauce that was balanced and elegant. But they were also soulless. They were the scallops that a competent chef prepared because it was the recipe in the system, not because they believed in them. Thomas could taste the difference. Where his original recipes had been born from experimentation and passion and dozens of failed attempts, these were perfected and standardized. Everything was reproducible. Nothing was alive. He ate slowly, watching the restaurant around him. The servers moved with practiced efficiency, but no genuine warmth. The customers ate their food without seeming to really taste it. It was a transaction, executed flawlessly but empty of meaning. When had it changed? He tried to pinpoint the exact moment, but it wasn't a moment at all. It was years of small decisions, each one reasonable and logical on its own, each one moving the restaurant incrementally further away from what it had been. When Thomas finished his meal, the general manager, a woman named Patricia who had been hired 7 years ago to oversee operations at all 3 locations, came to his table with a genuine smile that suggested she had actually been briefed by her staff that he might be important. "How was everything today?" Patricia asked, pulling out the chair across from him. "Perfect," Thomas said, and meant it in the most literal sense. Everything was perfect. Exactly as it should be. "That's wonderful to hear. We pride ourselves on consistency and quality. Are you a regular customer?" Thomas looked at her carefully. Patricia was probably in her early 50s, intelligent and professional, the kind of manager who had worked her way up through larger chains before Thomas's company had recruited her. She had no reason to know him. His retirement had been handled quietly, his involvement in the business deliberately minimized so that the brand wouldn't suffer from a sudden loss of leadership. "I've been coming here for a long time," Thomas said finally, "since before you were hired." "Well, I'm delighted to have you as a guest. Is there anything we can do to make your visit more memorable?" There was something crystalline about that question. Patricia was asking it sincerely, following what was probably a training protocol about customer satisfaction. And the answer was both everything and nothing. Nothing she could do would make it more memorable, because the memory was already complete. The restaurant had moved on. Thomas had moved on. The only thing that was stuck was him, clinging to something that had been beautiful once but could never be again. "Actually," Thomas said carefully, "I'd like to speak with you about something. I'm a former owner of this restaurant. I built the first location from the ground up in 1983. I came in this morning in work clothes, and your staff refused to serve me." He watched the color drain from Patricia's face, watched the moment of calculation cross her eyes as she processed what this meant for her job security, her reputation, the liability exposure. "Oh my God," Patricia said. "Mr. Whitmore, I had no idea you were— I mean, I know who you are, of course, I know the history, but I didn't recognize—" "Of course you didn't," Thomas said, not unkindly. "That's not your fault. The point isn't about me being recognized. The point is that your staff turned away a customer because of how he looked. That's not the culture I tried to build here." Patricia nodded rapidly, already in damage control mode. "You're absolutely right, and I'm deeply sorry. This is unacceptable. I will personally speak with our host staff about our inclusivity standards. We should never judge a customer based on appearance." "I know," Thomas interrupted gently. "I wrote that policy myself, back in 1985. It was the 3rd policy I wrote, after food quality and staff wages. We didn't have dress codes. We were supposed to serve anyone with respect and dignity, regardless of how they looked." "Yes, sir, that's still in our handbook. I can't imagine how this happened." "It happened because policies fade," Thomas said. "They become words in a handbook instead of principles people live by, and eventually they're ignored entirely." He paused, looking around the restaurant. "May I ask you something? Do you love this place?" Patricia blinked, caught off guard by the shift in conversation. Yes, of course. It's an honor to work here. The legacy, the reputation, that's not what I asked. Do you love it?" Patricia opened her mouth, then closed it. Thomas watched her struggle with the difference between the correct answer and the true answer. "I love my job," she said finally. "I take pride in the work." That wasn't an answer to his question, and they both knew it. Thomas left the restaurant and didn't return. Not the next day, not the next week. He had his assistant Carol send instructions to management about retraining the host staff and revisiting company culture policies. He received a sincere written apology from Patricia. The incident became a minor detail in the restaurant's institutional memory, probably smoothed over with a staff meeting and a memo. But something had shifted in Thomas himself. The last thread connecting him to the restaurant had frayed. What had been denial for years suddenly became acceptance. He was not part of this anymore. He had not been part of it for a very long time. The restaurant did not need him. The world did not need him, except as a historical footnote, the founder, the man who had built it all and then stepped away. That night, Thomas sat alone in his ranch house, 300 acres of property purchased 15 years ago, as a retreat, but rarely used. The house was too quiet. His dogs, two old labs named Scout and Mercy, lay by the fireplace, and the only sound was the occasional pop of the burning logs. He thought about the scallops he had eaten at his own restaurant. He thought about the young host's dismissive gesture. He thought about the years he had spent building something that no longer reflected him or his values. He thought about Clara, dead for 23 years, who had believed that hard work and good character were enough to create something meaningful. He thought about his children, who had learned early on that the restaurant was more important than they were. Thomas opened his laptop and began to research something he had been avoiding for years. Other restaurants, other chefs, other visions of what food service could be. He found himself reading about farm-to-table movements, about experimental kitchens in Prague and Copenhagen, about young chefs who were building something from nothing. He discovered a woman named Sophie Laurent who had just opened a small 40-seat restaurant in Brooklyn that was already being called revolutionary. No reservations, no dress code, no exclusion of any kind. Just food prepared by someone who loved what she was doing, served by people who actually cared. He sent an email to Sophie Laurent. He expected no response. He was a stranger, an old man on the internet, probably one of dozens reaching out to a rising star with unsolicited advice and offers of mentorship. She responded in 6 hours. Yes, she would love to meet him. She had heard of his work, knew the history of Whitmore's. She was struggling with capital for her expansion plans. Would he be interested in coffee? They met at a small place in Williamsburg, the kind of neighborhood restaurant Thomas associated with people his daughter's age. Rebecca was actually only 6 years younger than Sophie's 40. Sophie Laurent was exactly what the articles had suggested. Brilliant, passionate, restless with ideas. She talked about food the way Thomas used to talk about it in the early days. Not as a product, but as a form of communication, a way of showing people they mattered. The thing that kills restaurants, Sophie was saying, is when they forget why they started. They optimize everything, profit margins, food costs, customer turnover, and suddenly you're serving food that checks all the boxes but means nothing. Thomas listened, watching her hands move as she spoke, the animation in her face. He saw what he had been at 32. What would you do differently, he asked, if you had unlimited resources? Sophie laughed. That's easy. I'd hire people who actually wanted to be there. I'd pay them real wages, enough that they weren't stressed about survival. I'd cook food I actually believed in, even if some people thought it was weird. I'd close if we weren't being true to what we said we were. I'd prioritize the experience over the profit. I know that sounds naive. It's not naive, Thomas said. It's just harder than it sounds. He wrote Sophie a check that day, $200,000, for a minority stake in her restaurant and a promise to stay involved in mentorship. He set up a fund for her staff's health insurance and education benefits. He did it almost without conscious thought, moving on instinct rather than business acumen. Maria, his ex-wife, called him a week after the news of his investment became public in some small press restaurant journal. She wanted to know if he was having a midlife crisis, except he was 73, so it would have to be something else. I think I'm having a late-life clarity, he told her, about what I actually care about. And what's that? Maria asked. Thomas realized he couldn't quite name it. Purpose, maybe. Meaning. The sense that he was building something that actually reflected what he believed in, rather than just maintaining a machine that had taken on a life of its own. He began spending 2 or 3 days a week at Sophie's restaurant, not as an investor or a consultant, but as a line cook. He stood in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, prepping vegetables, learning Sophie's techniques, discussing flavor profiles and ingredient sourcing. His back hurt sometimes, his hands were not as quick as they had been. But he was alive in a way he had not been alive since Clara died. The restaurant got written up in the Times after 4 months. A chef and her unlikely mentor, the headline read, with a photo of Sophie and Thomas standing side by side, both covered in flour, both smiling like they had just won something important. Whitmore's, the original company, was unaffected by his involvement with Sophie's. The business continued to expand. Profits continued to rise. Patricia sent him quarterly reports that he barely read. The restaurants were doing everything right, by every measurable standard. They just weren't doing anything true. Thomas never returned to the flagship location, but one afternoon, about 2 years after the incident with the young host, he was in the neighborhood and decided to walk past the glass doors. He stood outside, looking in. The restaurant was full at 2 p.m., every table occupied, servers moving efficiently. The kitchen was a blur of activity. Everything was exactly as it should be. He thought about walking in, sitting at the best table, and revealing himself once more. But what would be the point? The restaurant was not waiting for him. It did not need him, and more importantly, he didn't need it anymore either. Thomas turned and walked away, and this time when he left, it was not with regret or longing. It was with something close to peace. By the time Thomas turned 75, Sophie's restaurant had expanded to 3 locations. Each one was a little different, reflecting the character of its neighborhood and its chef. But all 3 were united by a philosophy: food as an act of love, service as an act of respect, and profit as a consequence rather than a driving force. Thomas had invested in all 3, not just financially, but with his time and presence. His children saw him more often now. Rebecca brought her family to Sophie's flagship location. Daniel attended a dinner where Thomas prepared a dish he had created 43 years ago before the restaurant had become a machine, back when it had been a dream. Thomas's daughter asked him once why he had shifted so dramatically, why he was so clearly happier now than he had been in the decades when he was running the Whitmore empire. "Because I forgot something important," Thomas told her. They were sitting in Sophie's kitchen after service, sharing a bottle of wine while the cleaning crew worked around them. "I forgot that the restaurant was never supposed to be about me or the money or the brand. It was supposed to be about creating moments where people felt cared for, where they felt like they mattered. I got confused somewhere along the way about what I was building." "And you're not confused anymore?" Rebecca asked. "Not about that," Thomas said. "I'm still confused about plenty, but not about what actually matters." He picked up his glass and looked toward the kitchen where Sophie was reviewing next week's menu with her sous chef, her face animated and alive with purpose. Thomas thought about the young host at his restaurant, turning him away in his work clothes. He thought about the thousands of customers who had eaten at his restaurants and walked out without remembering a single meaningful thing about the experience. Then he thought about Sophie, who would probably never be as wealthy as he was, who would never have as many restaurants or as much press attention, but who would create something that mattered, something that people would remember, something that reflected truth instead of just projecting an image. "You know," Thomas said, "the young man who turned me away that day when I was wearing my work boots, I never saw him again. But I think about him sometimes. I wonder if he even remembers it, or if it was just another moment in a day of moments for him. Nothing special, nothing consequential." "Does it bother you?" Rebecca asked. Thomas considered this. "It used to, but now I'm almost grateful to him. He showed me something I needed to see. That I had become invisible in my own creation. That the thing I had built had completely replaced the person who built it." He smiled slightly. "And sometimes the kindest thing the world can do for you is turn you away. It forces you to look around and see what else is possible." 2 years later, Thomas suffered a minor heart attack while working in Sophie's kitchen. It wasn't serious. The doctors said it was a warning, a wake-up call to slow down, but nothing that required immediate intervention. He spent a week in the hospital and came out with orders to reduce his physical activity and manage his stress. He found that he couldn't really do either. The work in the kitchen, the creative problem-solving, the late nights standing beside Sophie as they refined a new menu, this was the thing that kept him alive. Stopping would be like stopping his heart intentionally. He cut back to 1 day a week in the kitchen and 2 days a week in a consulting role. He spent more time at his ranch, reading and sitting on his porch, watching the seasons change. He wrote a memoir that nobody asked for, capturing the early days of the restaurant industry, his failures and successes, what he had learned too late. Patricia retired from Whitmore's and was replaced by someone younger and more ambitious. Quarterly reports came in showing that the business was thriving, that franchises were planned, that the brand was preparing for significant expansion. Thomas read these reports the way someone might read about a famous actor they had once known in school, with mild interest and recognition, but no real emotional connection. He and Maria spent Christmas together 1 year, driving up to Rebecca's house in Vermont. It was the first Christmas they had spent in the same place since the divorce, something Rebecca had orchestrated through persistence and hope. They sat in front of her fireplace, three people who had shared a life once and then moved away from each other, trying to figure out if they could be friends now that they were no longer married. "Do you regret it?" Maria asked him at one point. "The restaurant, I mean, the whole thing." "No," Thomas said, "I don't regret it. But I regret what it became. I regret that I let it become that thing instead of fighting to keep it true to itself." "Could you have?" Maria asked gently. "Kept it true to itself, I mean, once it started growing?" Thomas had thought about this question many times in the years since he stepped away. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe that's just what happens to things. You create them in your image, and then they grow beyond you, and then they become something completely foreign. Maybe that's not a failure. Maybe that's just how the world works." "Or maybe," Maria said, "you have to keep reinventing yourself along with them. You have to grow the way the thing grows." "I'm not sure I'm capable of that," Thomas said. "I got stuck. I kept trying to protect something that didn't need protection. I became the thing that was holding it back." Rebecca, listening to both of them, asked, "Do you think you'd do it differently if you could go back?" Thomas looked at his daughter, this woman he barely knew because he had been so focused on the restaurant, and he realized something profound. The question she was asking wasn't really about the restaurant. It was about whether he would choose this life, the restaurant, the business, the decades of pursuit and build and push, over the people in this room and all the moments he had missed. "Yes," he said simply, "I would do it completely differently." When Thomas died in his sleep at 82, the New York Times ran a significant obituary. It mentioned his contributions to the restaurant industry, his founding of Whitmore's, his later work mentoring younger chefs. It included photographs of the original restaurant and of Sophie's now renowned establishments. There was a quote from Patricia, his longtime general manager, about his impact on hospitality. There were tributes from his children and his ex-wife. What the obituary didn't capture was that by the end of his life, Thomas had made peace with the fact that the thing he had created had become something he didn't recognize, and that the peace itself was the most important achievement he had ever accomplished. Sophie wept when she heard the news. She had considered Thomas a mentor and a friend, and she had discovered in working with him that the industry could be different, could center the people in it rather than the profits. She continued to run her restaurants according to the principles he had helped her clarify, and every time a new chef came to work for her, they learned the philosophy Thomas had eventually realized was the only one worth having. The young host who had turned him away that morning in his work boots probably never saw the obituary. He had quit working at Whitmore's 3 years later and become an insurance adjuster. But that single moment, the refusal, the dismissal, the casual gesture of turning someone away based solely on appearance, lived on in the lives it touched, in Thomas's journey toward understanding what actually mattered, in the path that led him to Sophie and the restaurants, where people who served food and people who ate food were all treated with basic dignity and respect. In the weeks after his death, a letter arrived at Sophie's restaurant addressed to Sophie and the team. It had been written by Thomas on his last birthday, addressed as an ethical will, not a legal document, but a set of values he wanted to pass on. "I built something I thought would last," he had written. "And it did last, but it became something I no longer recognized. That wasn't failure. That was me failing to understand something essential, that buildings and restaurants and institutions are just vessels. The only thing that actually matters is how you treat the people inside them. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Let people in, regardless of how they look, where they come from, or what they're wearing. Judge them by their character, not their appearance. Feed them like you're feeding people you love. Pay them like you respect their time. And never ever let the thing you've built become more important than the reasons you built it in the first place." Sophie framed the letter and hung it in the kitchen of every location she ran. Every new employee read it on their first day. It became the unofficial mission statement of her restaurants, passed along from generation to generation of chefs and servers and dishwashers. And in a way that Thomas had never managed with his empire, his actual values lived on. 10 years after Thomas's death, Sophie Laurent stood in her fourth restaurant, a location she had opened in her hometown of Boston, a city she hadn't lived in since leaving for culinary school at 19. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent 2 decades running away from this place, building herself in New York and Brooklyn and Philadelphia, determined to prove she was more than the sum of her origins. Now, at 55, she had come home. The space occupied what had once been a textile factory near the harbor. All exposed brick and high ceilings, and natural light streaming through enormous industrial windows. Sophie had designed it with the same principle Thomas had taught her. Function first, aesthetics only as an expression of that function. The open kitchen was visible from every seat in the dining room. There were no hidden spaces, no places where shortcuts could be taken unseen. Everything was transparent. She was reviewing inventory with her head chef, Marcus, when she noticed a man watching from the bar area. He was older, probably in his 70s, wearing worn jeans and a work jacket despite the warm September afternoon. Something about him pulled at Sophie's attention. Not his appearance exactly, but the quality of his stillness, the way he was looking at the kitchen with an expression that transcended casual interest. Sophie excused herself and approached him. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her tone genuinely welcoming. The man turned to look at her, and Sophie was struck by the clarity of his eyes. Blue-gray, intelligent, carrying the weight of lived experience. "I read about you," he said. His voice was rough, as though he didn't use it often for conversation. "Read about Thomas Whitmore's protégé. I wanted to see what he had built." Something shifted in Sophie's chest. "You knew him?" "I worked at his original restaurant," the man said, "back when it first opened. I was a sous chef then, helped develop some of the core recipes. My name is James Morrison." Sophie felt a sudden connection to the past, a living thread to the man who had changed her life. She pulled out a chair. "Please, sit. Tell me about it." James Morrison had thick hands that had worked a kitchen for more than 50 years. He was retired now, living in Boston with his wife of 43 years, had been for the last 5 years since he closed his own restaurant. A neighborhood place in Providence that had been his life's work before arthritis made standing for 12 hours a day impossible. He described the early days of Whitmore's in meticulous detail, the arguments about whether to include fish dishes, the night the heating system failed 3 days before opening and Thomas had called in favors to get it fixed, not sleeping for 36 hours straight. The first customer, an elderly woman who came in for breakfast and cried when she tasted the eggs because they reminded her of her mother's cooking. "We all believed in it," James said. "Thomas made you believe. He had this quality, he could convince you that what you were doing mattered, that every plate you sent out was a statement about who you were as a person. I was young and arrogant, and I needed that belief. I think a lot of us did." "What happened?" Sophie asked. "If it was so meaningful." "It grew," James said simply. "And when things grow, they change. I left in 1995, couldn't recognize what it had become. Opened my own place, smaller, the way I thought it should be. It was beautiful, but it was tiny. Never made much money. But it was mine, and it was true." He paused. "I heard Thomas came looking for something similar years later. Found you." "He found me," Sophie confirmed, "and he saved my life in a way. Not financially, though that helped, but philosophically. He had already learned what I was about to discover the hard way, that you can't build something meaningful if you're building it for the wrong reasons." James nodded slowly. "Can I ask you something? Why are you back here? You were a big success in New York. Why come back to Boston?" Sophie had been asked this question many times, and she had given many answers. Because the rent was cheaper, because she wanted to work with local farmers, because she wanted to be near her family. All of those things were true, but they weren't the whole truth. "Because I realized I was becoming what Thomas became," Sophie said carefully, "or what he was afraid of becoming. Each restaurant was adding revenue, expanding the brand, giving me more prestige and more distance from the actual work. I was starting to manage instead of create. I was starting to care more about the concept than the customers. And I thought about something he told me near the end of his life. He said that the moment you stop being the person who makes the food is the moment you start betraying your own mission." "So you started making the food again," James said. "I started making the food again," Sophie confirmed, "and I made some difficult decisions. I stepped back from 2 of the other locations, handed them off to chefs I trusted. I sold my stake in the franchise we were building. I took a significant pay cut. And I came back here, to my hometown, to build something small and true instead of something large and compromised. James looked around the restaurant, at the exposed brick and the careful simplicity of the design, at the kitchen where Sophie herself was visible working alongside her team. Thomas would have liked this, he said. I hope so, Sophie replied. I try to live by his values, even though I only knew him for the last years of his life, when he had already figured everything out. I wonder sometimes what he would have been like if he had figured it out 30 years earlier. He'd probably have done what you're doing now, James said. He was always too ambitious, too hungry. Some people can learn it sooner. Some people need to build an empire before they realize what it costs. They talked for another hour. James told her about the Providence restaurant, about the regulars who had come in every week for years, about the day he realized his hands hurt too much to keep going. Sophie told him about her journey, the mistakes, the slow understanding that success wasn't the same as meaning. Before James left, Sophie prepared a meal for him and his wife to take home, not from the regular menu, but something more personal, a dish inspired by one James had mentioned creating back in the early days of Whitmore's. It was her way of saying thank you, of honoring the lineage of chefs who had come before her, who had learned these lessons at different points in their lives and with different costs. After James left, Sophie found herself thinking about the trajectory of her career differently. She was 55 years old. If she lived to 85, she had 30 more years of work ahead of her. 30 more years to practice what she had learned from Thomas, to refine it, to pass it on to the next generation. She had never had children. She had been married briefly in her 30s to another chef, but the marriage had foundered on the fundamental incompatibility of two people who loved their work more than they loved each other. Since then, she had poured her parental energy into her staff, into the restaurants themselves, into mentoring younger chefs who showed potential. Marcus found her standing in the kitchen well after closing time, staring out at the empty dining room. "You okay?" he asked. Marcus had worked with Sophie for 7 years. He was 42, had trained in France, had briefly run his own small restaurant before it failed, and had come to work for Sophie seeking redemption, not from failure, but from the gnawing sense that he had been building something soulless. Under Sophie's mentorship, he had learned to cook with intention again. I was thinking about Thomas, Sophie said, about how he didn't fully understand what he had created until it was almost too late to do anything about it. But he did something about it anyway. He reinvented himself in his 70s. "You're not in your 70s, Marcus pointed out. "No, but I'm getting older. And I'm thinking about what I want my legacy to be. Not my restaurants. The restaurants will be what they are, and then they'll change or close, and that's fine. But what I want to pass on. What principles I want to embed so deeply in the culture of this place that they survive even after I'm gone." Marcus leaned against the counter. "Thomas's letter did that," he said. "It's been here since day one. Every person who's ever worked here has read it. I read it on my first day, and it changed something fundamental about how I thought about this job." "I know," Sophie said, "and I want to do something similar. Not just a letter, but an actual structure, a way of making sure that the values get reinforced constantly, not just on the first day." Over the next several months, Sophie implemented what she called the Whitmore Apprenticeship Program. Every year, her restaurants would select one young chef with talent and potential but limited resources, and would provide full training, salary, and mentorship for a 2-year period. The only requirement was that when their apprenticeship ended, they had to leave and go build something of their own somewhere else. They couldn't stay. The point was to send them out into the world, carrying the philosophy forward, to seed other kitchens and other restaurants with the principles Thomas had eventually learned and Sophie had inherited. The first apprentice was a 23-year-old woman named Lucia, who had grown up in a poor neighborhood in Boston and had discovered cooking almost by accident, through a high school food service program where a teacher had recognized something in her. Lucia had raw talent and hunger, literally and figuratively. She also had a grandmother she was supporting with her earnings, which meant that the financial stability of the apprenticeship was literally transformative. Watching Lucia learn was like watching Sophie rediscover her own early hunger and determination. Lucia asked questions constantly, worked harder than anyone else, experimented with recipes in her off hours, read every book Sophie recommended. She was creating, not just executing. She was building a philosophy about food, not just learning techniques. "Why are you doing this?" Lucia asked Sophie one evening while they were preparing for service. "Why would you invest in me just to let me leave?" "Because Thomas invested in me," Sophie said. "Not just money, though there was that, but time, attention, belief. He saw something in me, and he nurtured it not so that I would make him richer, but so that I would go out and make the world around me better. That's the only investment that actually pays back infinitely." By the end of Lucia's 2-year apprenticeship, she had a clear vision for what she wanted to build. Not a fancy restaurant, something small and community-focused, serving good food to people in underserved neighborhoods, using the apprenticeship stipend as seed funding to start a food cart. She left Boston with Sophie's blessing and her encouragement, carrying with her the principles that Thomas had learned and Sophie had preserved. Sophie heard from her occasionally, postcards from Philadelphia, then texts when Lucia got a phone plan. The food cart had become a small storefront. The storefront had become 2 locations. Lucia was starting her own apprenticeship program, selecting young chefs from backgrounds like her own. The chain was continuing, the philosophy was spreading. The impact was multiplying exponentially in a way that Sophie's restaurant expansion could never have achieved. This was the real legacy, Sophie began to understand. Not size, not prestige, not money, but the ability to inspire people to care about their work and to pass that caring on to others. It was the difference between building an empire and planting seeds. When Sophie turned 60, her 3 primary restaurants decided to throw her a significant birthday celebration. They wanted to make a big event of it. Media coverage, special menus, recognition of her achievements. Sophie pushed back, hard. "No," she said flatly, "I don't want a celebration of me. I want a celebration of the people who have come through these kitchens and are out in the world, now doing their own thing. I want to honor the apprentices, the people who trained here and left, and started something new. That's what deserves celebration." They compromised. Sophie's restaurants organized a reunion dinner, not at any of her locations, but at a large community center where they could bring together everyone who had worked for Sophie in any capacity over the past 15 years and had gone on to open their own businesses, teach cooking classes, work for non-profits, or otherwise contribute to their communities using the skills and philosophy they had learned. The dinner turned into something unexpected. It became a kind of testimony event where people stood up and talked about the moment they realized their work mattered, the specific conversation with Sophie that had shifted their perspective, the way they had carried her principles into their own lives. Some of them had opened restaurants. Others had started catering businesses or cooking schools or food non-profits. A few had left the restaurant industry entirely, but credited Sophie with teaching them something about excellence and integrity that applied to whatever work they ended up doing. One man named David, who had worked as a dishwasher in Sophie's original Brooklyn location and was now running a culinary training program for formerly incarcerated people, spoke about the day Sophie had noticed him struggling and asked him what his dream was. "I told her I didn't have dreams," David said. "I had a criminal record and a felony conviction, and I was grateful to be washing dishes. I wasn't thinking about dreams. And Sophie told me that everyone deserves dreams, that the size of your dream doesn't matter as much as your commitment to it. She offered to help me get into culinary school. She wrote recommendations. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And now, 15 years later, I've helped over 200 formerly incarcerated people find work in the food industry." That came directly from her. Sophie, listening to these stories, found herself thinking about Thomas in his final years. She wondered if he had heard stories like this from the people he mentored, if he had understood the ripple effect of his transformation. She wondered if he had any idea of the scale of impact that came from simply being present, believing in people, and helping them see their own potential. After the dinner, Sophie received a letter from someone she had never met, a woman named Eleanor, who worked as a food journalist in Toronto. Eleanor wrote that she had heard about the dinner through a friend and wanted to tell Sophie a story. 30 years ago, Eleanor's mother had worked as a chef at the original Whitmore's in New York. She had left when she got pregnant, unable to reconcile motherhood with the demands of the restaurant industry at that time. She had raised Eleanor with stories about Thomas, about the early days of that restaurant, about the philosophy that food was an act of love. Eleanor had not become a chef, but she had become a writer and journalist, and she had dedicated her career to telling stories about food and the people who made it. "I'm writing this to tell you that you're doing what Thomas did, but better," Eleanor wrote. "My mother carried his philosophy all her life. She taught it to me and my siblings. It shaped how we thought about work and integrity and caring for others. And now you're doing that intentionally, systematically, spreading it through an entire network of people who are going out and spreading it further. You've taken something that could have died with him, and you've made it alive and growing." Sophie kept that letter in a small frame in her office. She read it on days when she was tired, when the work felt overwhelming, when she questioned whether any of it mattered. By the time Sophie turned 65, she had begun the process of transition that Thomas had described in his ethical will. She was training Marcus to take over the day-to-day operations of her restaurants, while she shifted her role toward mentorship and vision. She was writing her own ethical will, documenting the principles that mattered most to her, the values she wanted her restaurants to continue embodying after she was gone. She had also begun working with culinary schools and non-profit organizations to formalize what had been informal, the process of identifying talented young chefs from limited backgrounds and providing them with training and support. The Whitmore Laurent Foundation, established with significant funding from Sophie's own resources, now provided full scholarships to 5 apprentices every year across multiple locations and programs. One afternoon, while reviewing applications for the following year's apprentices, Sophie came across an essay that stopped her cold. It was from a young man named Thomas Reeves, just 19 years old, who had grown up in foster care and had discovered cooking in a group home kitchen while helping the staff prepare meals. His essay was raw and honest and articulate about how food had saved his life, given him purpose, showed him that he could create something beautiful. What struck Sophie most was the moment in his essay where he wrote, "I never knew my real parents, but when I cook, I feel like I'm talking to people I'll never meet. Food is how I have a conversation with people who came before me. When I cook something with intention, I'm part of a chain of people stretching back through time, all of us trying to feed each other, trying to say, I see you, you matter, I want to take care of you. That's what I want to do with my life." Sophie called Marcus into her office and handed him the essay. "This one," she said. "We take this one." Thomas Reeves arrived at Sophie's flagship location in Boston on a cool morning in October, carrying everything he owned in a single backpack. He was thin and cautious, with the particular wariness of someone who had learned not to trust good things. Sophie had him start in the prep kitchen, washing vegetables, doing the most basic work. Over the first week, she watched him work. He approached each task with complete focus and intention. He didn't rush. He didn't cut corners. When someone pointed out he had missed a step in cleaning vegetables, he didn't get defensive. He simply listened and adapted. Sophie recognized something in him. She saw the young chef she had been, hungry and determined, and carrying the weight of all his hope in the skills he was building. On the Friday of his first week, Sophie pulled him aside. "How are you doing?" "Good," Thomas said, "really good. It's hard, but it's good." "I want to tell you something," Sophie said. "The thing about cooking is that it's a language. It's how you communicate care to people. And from what I've seen this week, you already know how to speak that language. You're careful with your work. You respect the ingredient. You understand that even the most basic task done with intention has value." She paused. There was a man named Thomas Whitmore who figured that out late in his life. He used to own a big restaurant empire, but he lost track of why he was doing it. By the time he understood again, he had wasted decades. "I don't want that to happen to you. I want you to keep what you have right now, this clarity about why you're doing this. Hold on to it fiercely." Thomas nodded seriously, absorbing the advice the way he absorbed everything, completely and without distraction. Over the next 2 years, Thomas worked in every position in Sophie's kitchens. He learned from Marcus about technique and consistency. He learned from Sophie about philosophy and intention. He read Thomas Whitmore's ethical will so many times it was marked with notes and underlined passages. He cooked dishes from Sophie's early days and from her experimental new menus. He attended farmers markets with her, learning about sourcing. He listened while she mentored other young chefs, understanding that teaching was as much a part of excellence as executing. And slowly, through observation and conversation, Thomas developed a clear vision for what he wanted to build. "I want to open a restaurant in my hometown," he told Sophie near the end of his apprenticeship. "It's a small city, economically depressed, lots of people like me, people who've had hard lives and are trying to figure out how to matter. I want to build something that says, your story matters, your hunger matters. You deserve to eat food made with care." "Will you make money?" Sophie asked. "I hope so, eventually. But that's not the point. The point is creating a place where people feel seen." Sophie nodded. "Then you're ready. You're more than ready." When Thomas left to start his restaurant in a small city in upstate New York, Sophie gave him a handwritten copy of Thomas Whitmore's ethical will, bound in leather with his name embossed on the cover. She also gave him the recipe for the dish that Whitmore had created in his early days, the same one Sophie had prepared for James Morrison years earlier. The dish that represented the philosophy, the intention, the belief that food was a form of love. "Give this restaurant time," Sophie told him. "Don't rush the growth. Quality over speed, integrity over profit. The money will follow if you get the rest right, and if it doesn't, you'll still have something that matters." Thomas took the advice seriously. His restaurant, called Reeves, opened in a formerly abandoned building in downtown Watertown, New York. He served food that was simple but perfect, the kind of cooking that took more intention than technical complexity. His staff were people like him, people with difficult backgrounds, people who had been overlooked, people who had learned through hard experience that kindness was a choice you had to make actively and repeatedly. Within 5 years, Reeves had a following that extended well beyond the small city. Food writers came, chefs came, but Thomas didn't expand, he didn't franchise. He kept it small and true, the way Sophie had taught him. He started his own apprenticeship program, selecting young people from broken homes and difficult circumstances, giving them what had been given to him. Sophie visited his restaurant on its 5th anniversary. Sitting at a table in Reeves, eating food that clearly came from someone who understood what they were doing, Sophie felt a sense of closure and continuation simultaneously. The chain was unbroken. The philosophy was not being lost. The values that Thomas Whitmore had learned in his 70s, that Sophie had inherited and refined and systematized, were now alive in the hands of a young man who had grown up with nothing. "You've done something important," Thomas said to Sophie that night. They were sitting in his small office after service had ended. "You took something that could have died with one man, and you made it live again. And now it's in me. And in a few years, it'll be in whoever I mentor." It's like immortality, but not the kind people usually think of. It's not about being remembered, it's about the ideas living on, the values spreading. "That's all we really get," Sophie said. "None of us get to be immortal. But our ideas can be. Our values can be. The way we treat people can echo forward through time in a chain of people who learned from us." She thought about Thomas Whitmore, dead now for nearly 30 years. She thought about James Morrison, the sous chef from the original restaurant, who was probably in his 90s now if he was still alive. She thought about all the people who had worked in kitchens and learned something about excellence and integrity and care, and had carried that forward into their own work and their own lives. The chain was long and getting longer. It would extend forward into a future Sophie would never see, carried by people she would never meet, shaped by the principles that Thomas Whitmore had eventually learned and that she had made her life's work to preserve and spread. It was the most important thing she would ever do. It was more important than critical acclaim, more important than financial success, more important than expansion and empire. It was the knowledge that she had changed something essential about how people thought about their work and their responsibility to the people they served. On the drive back to Boston, Sophie listened to a podcast about the restaurant industry. The host was discussing the current crisis in hospitality, the burnout, the staff turnover, the way restaurants were treating workers as disposable resources instead of valuable people. The conversation was familiar. It was the same conversation Thomas had been having in his mind for years before he finally acted on it. Sophie pulled over and called Marcus. "I want to do something," she said. I want to develop a formal program for restaurants that want to shift their culture, their approach to treating staff, their philosophy. I want to help them figure out how to be sustainable without being exploitative, how to be profitable without betraying their values. That's a big project, Marcus said carefully. I'm not getting any younger, Sophie replied, and I have more to offer than just my own restaurants. If I can help other restaurant owners understand what I've learned, if I can help create a movement toward treating hospitality work as something that deserves dignity and compensation and respect, then maybe the impact extends even further. By the time Sophie turned 70, she had spent the last 5 years consulting with restaurants all over the Northeast. She had worked with legacy restaurants trying to reclaim their founding vision. She had worked with new restaurants trying to build the right culture from the beginning. She had trained dozens of young managers in the philosophy of servant leadership, the idea that your job was to serve your staff so they could serve your customers. The work was slower than building new restaurants. It was less visible, less celebrated, but it was profoundly satisfying in a way that even her most successful restaurant ventures had never been. One evening, while reviewing notes from a consultation with a restaurant in New Jersey that was struggling with staff retention and burnout, Sophie realized something. This was what Thomas had been trying to do in his own way when he had stepped back from his restaurant empire. He hadn't known how to do it at first. He had floundered, tried to fix things from the outside, eventually given up on fixing the empire itself and instead focused on building something new and true. But what if he had known then what he knew later? What if, instead of running away from the restaurant industry to start fresh with Sophie, he had tried to transform the industry itself? Would it have been possible? Would one person, no matter how influential, be able to shift the entire system? Probably not. That wasn't how systems changed. Systems changed through countless individuals making different choices. One kitchen at a time, one restaurant at a time, one person at a time, choosing integrity over profit. Choosing people over growth, choosing meaning over expansion. That was the real lesson. Thomas had learned it too late to apply to his own empire. But Sophie could see it clearly, and she could spend the rest of her life propagating it, helping others understand it, building a culture where that understanding was normal instead of exceptional. She was 70 years old. She probably had 10 or 15 good years left if she was lucky. She intended to spend every day of those years exactly as she was spending them now, showing people that there was another way to do this work, that restaurants could be profitable and ethical, that success didn't require the destruction of the people making it possible. Late one night, Sophie was working on an article for a hospitality industry journal about sustainable restaurant practices. She was writing about the difference between restaurants that treated their staff as disposable and restaurants that treated them as essential, irreplaceable partners in the business. She was writing about the data showing that restaurants with higher staff retention, better wages, and more supportive culture actually had better outcomes. Better food, better service, better customer satisfaction, more sustainable business models. As she was revising a paragraph, she paused over something she had written. The restaurant business is fundamentally about relationships. Relationships between the chef and the ingredient. Relationships between the server and the customer. Relationships between the manager and the staff. The moment you start treating any of these relationships as